Welcome to Consent Conversations, where we ask the tough questions about consent and we give our viewers like you the important answers. I'm Joyce Short, and I'm the author of Your Consent, The Key to Conquering Sexual Assault. And I'm joined by our co-host, Nina Lucas, who is the Chief of Staff for the Consent Awareness Network and our Consent Outreach Ambassador in Pennsylvania. So how are you, Nina?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks again for another great episode that we're going to have.
We had just a wonderful day on this past Tuesday, introducing A6540, the Assembly Bill, to the press. And unfortunately, you couldn't be there, but I know you were there in spirit. And I think that it's, a tremendous step towards doing the right thing and getting consent properly defined in our laws. So
it's
today,
a very exciting time. Very exciting.
Very exciting. Mm-hmm. And today we have a special guest, and that's Patty Pastor, who is the legislative lead for Now New York and the president of Now in Nassau County. And she has a private practice as an attorney dealing with assault and sexual assault and harassment cases. So welcome to Patty. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
It's really delightful to have you here and to get your know-how about this really perplexing issue of consent. I know you've seen the bill that was introduced by Assemblymember Rebecca Seawright, and I want to get your views on that bill.
Yeah, I think the bill is very important. It's a critical first step in changing the language of our laws around rape and sexual assault. Leaving consent undefined as it's been for so long is an extreme disservice to the women of our state and to the men as well, because we know that women are not the only sex crime victims. So currently under New York's penal law, it's an element of every sexual offense that the sexual act was committed without the victim's consent. That's section 130.05. Yet, in place of defining consent, the legislature attempts to define lack of consent by giving examples of lack of consent, such as forcible compulsion, incapacity. In sexual abuse cases, lack of consent is when the victim does not expressly or impliedly acquiesce in the actor's conduct. Well, that's not a definition. That tells us what consent is not. Obviously, many things can be not consent. To define something, we need the meaning of the term, not its negative. So when you look up consent in the dictionary, I don't think it says not acquiescence or not forcible compulsion. In addition, the statute's descriptions of lack of consent are inconsistent. So they change depending on the type of sexual act, the degree of the crime, etc. So for third-degree rape, lack of consent means that the victim clearly expressed that she did not consent to engage in such act, and a reasonable person in the offender's situation would have understood the victim's words. So we're worried about a reasonable offender. This language is very protective of offenders. It does not require that the offender seek consent before engaging in sexual activity. It does not put the onus on the actor. Instead, it requires that the victim make extreme efforts to ensure that she explicitly expresses her non-consent to sexual activity. As a society, as a culture, and as a government, we need to stop this pattern. For example, shouldn't we require a person who wants to engage in sexual intercourse with, for example, a woman, to make the minimal effort to find out if she actually wants to do that? One fairly easy way to do that is a little known secret. Ask her. Yeah. It's not hard. It's really simple. Yeah. Another hint. If the woman, in response to what you're saying or doing, is mute, unresponsive, pushes you away, shakes her head no, looks afraid, looks like she's in pain or shock, appears angry, is frowning, doesn't look happy, or is intoxicated or inebriated, barely coherent, it's a fair guess that she doesn't consent to having sex with you. So this is a critical step, and I'm really glad that we're moving in this direction, and I certainly hope the bill does get passed so we can begin heading in a better direction in the language that we use.
Absolutely.
In our laws.
many years ago, we came up with this concept of no means no, where the person would have to say no. And as we both know, there are a great many people that simply, a tonic immobility takes over, and they just freeze and are unable to say no. Subsequently, here in New York, people recognize the dysfunction in no means no, and so they tried to turn it into yes means yes. But in that circumstance, we're also putting the responsibility on the victim, and yes can only mean yes if the person actually is freely giving knowledgeable and informed agreement. If the person who is inducing their agreement is using some form of malice, like force or fear or fraud, no matter how many times or how emphatically the victim says yes, they're not consenting. And we understand that in the Bernie Madoff case, right? In the Bernie Madoff case, people went chasing after him with their money, saying, please, please, please take my money. That doesn't mean that they consented, because he lied to them about everything. And so if you're forcing the person, or you're making them fearful, or you're deceiving them, then no matter whether you say yes or not, and unfortunately, when you make it a yes means yes concept, when you make consent a yes means yes concept, you're eliminating the real crux of consent, which is that it cannot be, you cannot achieve consent if you're using malice in order to get agreement. And that, and only that, should be what's on trial when the offender, when the accused, goes into a courtroom and a decision is made on their guilt or innocence. What are your thoughts?
That's right, Joyce. I think you're absolutely right. And in addition to that, another factor that is relevant in consent is the relationship between the parties. So where you have an extreme power imbalance, such as with the Catholic Church cases, where you have a priest and a young altar boy or a young person that's relying on them for advice, where you have a therapist and a survivor of trauma, where you have a CEO of a company and a young employee, or just an employee of any age. Those types of situations begin with a power imbalance. The power imbalance in the relationship inherently is causing that to be a non-consensual.
Of course, yeah, they're exploiting their power in order to really to coerce the person to use really fear, because that person fears that they'll lose their job, or whatever other impacts could result from denying a person that has power over you, especially for children that are sexually abused by a parent, right? Perfect example of power differential, and that child, their whole life is tied with that parent, whether they eat, whether they have clothes, whether they go to school, whether they have a roof over their head. And so, yes, absolutely, we can't exploit a power differential in order to, that would come under coercion. And fortunately, this bill includes, but is not limited to, the forms of malice that are actually stated in the bill. So Nina, anything that you'd like to add to that?
I'm doing so much social media, and I'm seeing so many hashtags that are very misleading, like you spoke of, yes means yes, or enthusiastic consent, in that, it's not consent unless there's an enthusiastic yes. Well, we can see that that's problematic, and, it doesn't address issues of force, fear, or fraud. And also, you can be relaying or giving consent without being enthusiastic. It's not necessary to be jumping up and down, although that might be fun as well. So I do think that it's about education and letting people know that we are not to be looking to the victim and victim blaming about their behavior and what they were doing during an assault.
It doesn't matter how emphatically the person says yes. It matters whether the accused has used malice in order to elicit their response. So we have, fortunately, some words from Andrea Constand that we're going to play for you now.
I'm Andrea Constand. I was shocked to hear that New York and Pennsylvania have no definition for consent in their laws. I learned this by the Cosby and Weinstein trials. Both judges could not respond to the question when the jurors asked for the definition. Instead, they told the juries to use their common sense. The foreperson for the jury in my case was aware of the definition for consent in the General Data Protection Regulation, which is international law. GDPR states that consent is freely given, informed agreement. We need every jury to understand this definition in order to convey equal protection to everyone. As a healthcare provider, I am required to get each client's consent. And consent in medical treatment is defined as freely given, informed agreement. The definition for consent does not change depending upon what you are consenting to. Nothing less than defining consent as freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement will protect the residents of New York and Pennsylvania and every state from sexual assault. Society desperately needs this transformational reform in our laws before one more person is defiled by a sexual predator who fails to grasp what consent actually is because our laws fail to tell them so. Thank you.
So Patty, I'm sure that you've seen a lot of cases where consent is a factor.
Absolutely. I think it comes up to some extent in almost all of my sexual assault cases. Our culture accepts the way our laws put the onus on the victim,
Yeah.
and don't require consent on the part of anybody that is going to engage in sexual activity. That it's, that person who's interested in having sex needs to ask, needs to honor the answer.
Sometimes you ask, but if you're being coerced, right, you're going to say yes because you're afraid. So just the very, by resting whether or not consent takes place on what the victim says is really completely eliminating the real concept of consent. And that is that it must be freely given, knowledgeable, and informed. And if someone is coercing you, even if you say yes, you're still not consenting. And that's
Right.
why it's so important to have the definition of consent in our laws.
So many of our current laws across the US, they just embrace this kind of victim blaming and really rape mentality, where, they are written in such a way where we're going to look at the victim and say, well, what were you doing there? How were you dressed? Why did you drink too much? And none of these are behaviors that deserve sexual assault.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And the law, unfortunately, supports people taking advantage of the situation and doesn't take into account the ways people respond when they're afraid.
Exactly.
The ways people respond when they feel overwhelmed or when there's a power imbalance. All of these things impact a victim's response.
Yeah.
It's the person who is seeking to have sex and who is moving forward with sexual activity to notice and to be aware of their partner's responses.
Yeah. And also they have to notice what they're doing in order to elicit that partner's cooperation. They know if they're using force or fear or fraud. Even if the victim doesn't know it, Larry Nassar, we discussed the impact of coercion to exploit the victim, but also in instances of fraud. That these people absolutely complied. They complied with everything that he asked them to do. But he told them that what he was doing was medically necessary. It wasn't. And so when you fool someone, when you trick someone, they can be complying, but they're complying because you have exploited them with fraud. And our laws need to state that as well.
In the case of the Larry Nassar assaults, certainly the victims agreed to a medical exam, but what they didn't agree to was the fraud, concealment, and artifice of the sexual assault.
We have this definition for consent there. It's freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement. And what the additional language does is it simply explains what's meant by that. They're not add-ons. It's what's included in that.
This is being introduced, this definition of consent, into general law.
Yeah.
So not only will it clarify matters in sexual assault, but also in all types of fraud, religious and cult abuse, sexual and human trafficking, and the list just goes on, because consent is consent. It's the same anywhere, whether it's in sexual assault or financial fraud, it's the same.
If you're getting on a bus and your pocketbook is open and somebody puts their hand into your pocketbook and takes your wallet, that person is stealing from you. And regardless of the fact that your pocketbook was open, it's the actions of the accused and not the actions of the victim that makes behavior a crime. So, Patty, thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks for your wise counsel. Loved having you here.
I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be supporting the bill.
Yes. So folks, you can help support A6540 and help it get passed. And if it does get passed here in New York, because you might be wondering why, if you don't live in New York, why it matters to you. And it's because legislation is copied from one state to another and from one jurisdiction to another. And if we pass it here in New York, I should say, when we pass it here in New York, it's going to echo throughout the halls of justice here in New York and all around the world. You can log on to Assembly Bill A6540 on their webpage. We're going to list the URL address for you down below. And on that webpage, you're going to see that you can upvote it with an A or a nay, and you can also leave a comment on that webpage. So we're going to ask that you do that, as well as log on to our webpage for consentawareness.net. We're going to list the web address for you down below, and we have a page specifically so that you can log on and you can see who the legislators are in the Codes Committee. You can see their telephone numbers and their email addresses. With one click, you can call them or you can write to them. We prefer that you make those telephone calls because it lights up their switchboard and it has a little bit more impact than an email that they can simply disregard. So the more the merrier. We want to make sure that the consent train, which has now left the station, makes it to the next station, and we can do that with your help. So thanks for joining with us today. And we hope that our efforts all together can make the world a safer place. See you next time.
My body's not a token, my body's not a prize. Don't you dare defile me with coercion, force or lies. My body's not yours to take, it's all mine to give. It's not your entitlement, it's where I live.